Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back in Cape Town. This has been an amazing conference, and I'm really honored to be part of this group and showing you the work. Adjaye Associates, which is the company I formed really in 2000, the beginning of the millennia, is a firm which is sort of dedicated to 4 strands, really. Research and sort of extensive research, which culminates in publications, and we've just done the first one, and I'll show you that very quickly. Experiments in product, furniture, sort of environments, emotive environments, and then some sort of the evolution of residential typologies in the world, and I'll show you some examples of that, and public buildings in its widest form, and that sort of discourse now. As was said, the central concern and interest is the way in which architecture now has to respond to the changing world, the way in which we have to kind of think about the kind of responsibility that we have to the public realm, and how the act of making, which is laborious, still slow, still tedious, takes 4 years, a year to design, matters and shapes the lives of the people that inhabit it, citizens, etc. So how do we talk about these things? Firstly, practice. I am of Ghanaian parents. My father was of that generation of, Nkrumah, diplomats. Nkrumah was the first sort of president of, a first free country in Africa from the colonial period. And, I was kind of brought up with that discipline of, being a professional in the world and being proud to be a professional in the world, and not just to be a professional of just African heritage, but a professional person in the world who is interested in the planet and interested in the affairs of the world, not to limit yourself. So in a way, I've sort of found myself making a practice which is polyphonous and is about creating satellites in places where we work. We started here, I'm from here, we started here, we moved here, we're now in America, and we're here in Accra. We just opened this summer. And for me, it's about making agency in places where the work occurs. It's not about speculating and finding work. It's not a commercial endeavor. It's about the kind of the speculating and the mining of opportunity that can happen in different places. And if that is relevant, we will be there, and we will sort of make places in that environment. The first piece of research, which happened after 11 years of work, was to first started off as a little sort of autobiography for me. It was about really taking a step back after leaving Africa when I was 14, being brought up in Europe. I wanted to come back on my own terms, not through my family. So I spent 11 years going to every single country and documenting the architecture of the continent. So I recorded every single city in terms of its high and low architecture, in terms of its bucolic aspect, and its kind of the qualities that kind of people understand, and really to try and get a sense in myself of what the continent means now. The political map of Africa is the one that we all have got ingrained and programmed in our minds. But for me, in the 21st century, I suggest that this is really the map of Africa. This is the new geographic map which shows the 6 terrains and the shifting terrains that are in Africa. The forest, which was much greater before, is now the blue. The savanna is the light green. The purple are the mountains. The orange is the edge of the desert, the thing that is holding the desert from creeping right down to West Africa, and the Maghreb, which is the Mediterranean cusp. And I think through this map, for me, we've started to kind of formulate a way of practice which is not only affecting the way I work in the continent, because I'm now working here, but also the way I work in the world, which is that geography, culture, and place are so inextricably linked, and more so now in the world that we live in, and that actually to understand maybe a relationship in Africa, maybe we have to move beyond saying, this is South African architecture or Ghanaian architecture, but this is a kind of architecture of place, of the forest region, an architecture of the mountain region, an architecture of the Sahel. And then what you start to find is that even though you may be francophone or anglophone, there are incredible connections which are coming through geography and place, which are binding you, and you might not know it. And that's been extraordinary during this 11-year journey to see those connections. And that's a profound thing that's kind of affecting the way we're working all the time now. So this book just came out last year, and we're really proud of it. And now we're doing other studies right now, looking at different parts of the world and trying to understand the way in which the built environment has been made and how it kind of affects people. Second section is really to talk about the evolving topologies in the world. And disaster and places of delicate ecosystems is something that's becoming more present in our world. And it's something that I think architects have to kind of be absolutely engaged in. Asempa is a Ghanaian word which means a good story. Really is about how to make a response to a disaster, which I think was probably the first big sort of urban disaster that we've seen in sort of in our century, which sort of woke us all up to how fragile our cities are. And that is New Orleans and Katrina. I think Katrina was that media event which really kind of blew up in our minds that, wow, we are in a fragile ecology. And I think architecture has to respond to that. There's a fantastic charity called Make It Right, which asks 10 architects to come in and work on creating new topologies for these communities. Where the flood happened was, of course, the poorest part of the city, because, of course, New Orleans is built below sea level, but the highest point is obviously the downtown, which was not affected. And the lowest part, the residential areas, are where the floods occurred. New Orleans is famous for its Mardi Gras and incredible festivals. It's a kind of an incredible multicultural melting pot. But the breach happened in the most devastating part. This is the most delicate part between the sort of the sea and the sort of this Mississippi coming in. And you can imagine these incredible ecosystems suddenly becoming the places of extraordinary trauma. So in a sort of very quick second, our cities and our organizations can be completely destroyed and devastated. And I think if there's a lack, if we allow mechanization to just build the environments that we're in, and we feel that as architects and designers, we absorb that responsibility because it's in that sector, we create potentials like this. And I think that this shows, for me, an example why architecture or design is, rather, should I say, design is required ever more with mechanizations to kind of make more responsive scenarios to climate. These are the shotgun houses of New Orleans. These are some of the kind of more responsive houses, commercial architectures that were there. This was something we looked at. We were asked to come in and really rebuild, make a model of sort of cheap housing. The cheapest house that a house builder could make was the budget we had to use. But we had to flip that and to make it respond and to make it do more than just be the sum of an enclosure for a family. So we questioned everything: foundations, roof, the way in which you made panelization. We analyzed the typical house, which was a slave house, and then said, why now let's invert and change everything about this to something new. We said, if this is what housing does, if the roofs usually traditionally collect water, our traditional perception is you need a roof to collect a drain to then go into the stormwater sort of runoff. But actually stormwater runoffs fail because we have too much urbanization. And so they kind of blow back. So actually what we need to do is collect water so we can use it as grey water. So we said all the roofs have to be inverted. Collect them, just take them off and flip them up and use them as cups that collect the rain, and use it to also collect the sort of energy from the sun. But also in doing that, you create a new topology. You move the topology from a pyramid to an inverted pyramid, so a collector of energy rather than one that's trying to kind of protect itself from the world. So this became a motif that we thought was powerful and could become something new. We talked about all the floodplain issues, making houses that would allow themselves to be above the 500-year flood as a basic minimum. And also to say that in New Orleans, which at the ground plane is extremely hot, but at the upper level, and you see the kind of balconies of the rich houses, is extremely cool because suddenly you get the currents. Why can't everybody have that sort of luxury? So move away from an architecture of being on the ground and hot and move to an architecture of being in the air. This is the rebuilding of our sites. The 10 architects are all in here. It's a bit dark, but this is one of my houses. There are about 20 of these houses built. It's a system which was given to the community for free. We offered our services for free for this project. And basically, there are patterns, almost like house building patterns. If your house was destroyed in the 9th ward, you can go to the ward, choose a pattern, and work through their mortgage system to then get your house remade into one of these designs. This has been going for quite a few years, and we've been developing the evolution of it, and it's just amazing to see how people have been using these spaces. This space not only works, we talked to FEMA, and what they started to kind of say was really powerful about this for them was that this allowed, what some of the biggest problems about a flood is that actually not so much escaping the water, but actually having somewhere to stay for maybe 1, 2, 3 weeks whilst the rescue team comes to find you, if you're in the middle of nowhere. And so the idea of having a space that could be absolutely inhabited and safe is also paramount, not just a place that you could help, but the family could go up there and wait, and the structure was robust enough. This is just the latest one that was recently built that we're really proud of. And so this sort of the evolution of the color, the form, the construction techniques are happening. And this is the traditional house here. And this is this new type. And we had images recently of a wedding that was celebrated in here, and we were really, really excited by that. This is that building that's just been completed. This is just looking at the evolution of two, one of the early ones and one of the later ones. Some people, I think that we build houses just sort of as commissions, but we actually take on houses that for us question new modes of work and life, new modes of construction, etc. And I'm going to take you through 3 houses. First one we called the Sunken House, and it really was about making a low-cost house in the developed world, but trying to explore something which was about zero carbon. So how can we use the best of mechanization? These techniques are now becoming much more common, but when we did this house in 2005, 2006, it was completely new. We said we would make a zero-carbon house, totally prefabricated in a factory made out of compressed timber, and then we would clad it in a spruce, which would then become the kind of primary material in the space. The site where this house is made is in the East End, in the sort of conservation area of the East End. So we were lucky to work with the borough to be able to put a contemporary piece of architecture in a sort of Victorian landscape. I show you this because it's really critical, that it was basically about making an excavation, this is the street level, putting in a concrete slab and dropping this from a factory in 4 days onto the site. And then the cladding and the dressing took, the rest of the time to do. But the construction technique, and you see this graphic, is really all the same. It's this timber, solid compressed section, which is engineered into different sizes. The acoustics, the kind of construction, and the whole kind of way in which you make it takes away from that hollowness of dry line. It was the idea of trying to make something which had the integrity of its form built into the nature of the way in which it's fabricated. But also then, for me, it has to then become something that's emotional, becomes a place that can be human, and kind of express the kind of humanity that we want in the sort of manufacturing. This is the house, so you can imagine when it first came up, there was a lot of controversy in the neighborhood. There were really some very upset people who thought we devalued their neighborhood. And now this house has got a lot of attention and is the sort of pride of the community. But it was a very unusual creature that arrived. It has a kind of roof terrace. There's a bed, basically. This is an open bed for the summer. Which is this little secret for the couple to escape from their kids and from everybody else if they want, and hide in the roof. It's super simple. There's one window in the facade, and it frames a very important sort of church, which is the sort of this beautiful Gothic piece. And it's all about the staircase, which is made out of veneered plywood, walnut veneered plywood, which runs in a sort of vertical sort of triple-light space through the chamber. And then you realize that the living room is basically in the trees. So we made one piece of glass that frames the trees, and so your aspect, because the site is incredibly narrow, all the other houses have gardens, you don't, it's just in a plot, but it takes advantage of what is that London rear view. If you know London houses, the most beautiful thing about the Victorian terrace is the gardens and the allotments and the commons that are behind. And usually the houses have beautiful fronts and really terrible rears. And I think the late part of the 20th century in London has been about young architects ripping down the rears of these Victorian buildings to put up glass facades, to look at this beautiful thing thing which everybody forgot about and thought was kind of ugly. So this is a house that says, no, actually, its primary response is that, and its secondary response is now the street, which is the urban landscape. In the court, this is a living room. So very simple details. By taking away manufactured windows, but just buying glass as we could, we were able to keep the cost down. So these are not sort of factory-made windows, but just gasket units, and then we've sort of engineered the system and the sealant to kind of put them in. And then ventilation really happens with these panels, doors or little portals all over the house. Glass is fixed. Ventilation is these moving solid panels, which makes the cost cheap. This is the sunken chamber, which then allows to see a private space from the kitchen, etc., and go around the house and then to see the landscape. Just moments and junctions that can be enjoyed. And then the next project. This is a house in New York that we completed a couple of years ago, which is at the extreme end. We work in for us, we work at low and high. And this is a house in probably one of the most sort of bougie parts of New York. It's in Park, just off Park Avenue. This is Park Avenue here. This is 77th Street. So it's on the east side of New York. This is my site here, which is probably the remnant of what happens if you know about New York zoning. Basically, you have as of right, and this is what New York eventually became. This is the zoning that allows you to build this much. But these properties probably sold their rights to adjacent properties, so in the end, were not allowed to be developed. So there are these 2 carriage houses left. My client bought one of those, and that's where the project sort of happens. This project, where you have suddenly a client who wants a house, essentially the house is developed for art. It has an extensive art collection in it. But what we tried to do is to say, how can we make a house in an urban context like New York with its incredible history and layering? So we said, why don't we take the clues of the planning and zoning of New York as a way to drive the relationship and the kind of form? So this is the existing facade of the building. We clipped a little form, a really extreme form next to it. We made a light well. And then we made another form, the second tower, which contains the living room and the main principal space that you come in. It's basically a gallery. You walk straight into a gallery for hanging art. And then we made a third form, which is this vertical shaft, which steps up as you go up. And then a fourth chamber here, which reveals all the foundations, because we dug down 3 stories below, and we went up 5 stories. So it's a kind of vertical shaft that cuts through New York and allows you to see the way in which the city is made. And you realize that actually the terra firma of New York is not really the terra firma. It's actually a couple of layers below, and that people think they're walking on the ground, but actually they're not. It's an artifice. And actually the ground plane is actually somewhere 2 stories, 3 stories below. And when you cut through that, you see what New York was made up of. It was schist stone, which is this extraordinary granite which made the city, timber compression forms, and the foundations are all there. They're still under the city. The city is a piece of archaeology, and the architecture in a way presents a kind of way of looking at the city vertically and horizontally as a kind of new type in the city. So here it is. It's made out of black cast concrete. This is its initial form. It slips out and then sort of presents a new sort of entrance. This is the gallery that you come into. You can drive a truck straight into the front. It's probably the only Park Avenue house that you can drive a truck straight into, only because the things that you've got in there are very wealthy and you want to make sure that you're not schlepping them on the street. So we developed a bridge with an incredible museum-scale door to get you in there. The residence comes straight up, and you see the first light well, which articulates the 2 towers. This is the third light well, where you suddenly see this is the original foundations of the city, and we framed it. The beams collapse around it to brace it, and so you see it and you reveal it. And the concrete, we spent an exorbitant amount of money teaching New York contractors to do bad concrete. I was like, let's make dry, handmade concrete. I want to see the life in it, and I wanted concrete to behave like geology. I wanted it to look like what it is. It's earth, it's material out of the ground, not a sort of artificial artifice. So my interest in concrete is the way in which it performs, displaying weight, materiality, texture, imperfection, and the whole house is sump poured, so you have these extraordinary creases and lines. It looks like the skin of an elephant. Living space. So you're looking through 3 layers. You're looking to the outside, the thin chamber, The first light well, this second one, and the one that I showed you before is behind you. This is that thin chamber, which is a library, and sort of looks through. And then this is looking the entire way through light well 1, light well 2, light well 3, and the outside. And then this is that central one, which talks about the urbanism. So you see the architecture kind of, and the sort of light wells and the sort of back towers. And then in the evening, this spectre. Public projects becomes the largest part of the office and the biggest area that we're working on. And it works through commercial projects, well, very few commercial projects. If it's commercial, it's usually institutions that we're working with, but it's really culture and education predominantly. This is called Francis Gregory. Very important sort of series that I've been working on is the notion of libraries and this idea of dealing with this sort of irrelevant conversation that libraries are no longer necessary, that they're out of date, that everybody's going to be on Macs or whatever else. And it started with the Idea Store in Whitechapel, which is a project I won many years ago, but this is a kind of evolution of it where what we've been testing is understanding that the library, yes, may not be the kind of, the sort of depository of information only in the world anymore, but what has happened is that the typology has evolved to become a public room for citizens, and actually to just wipe it out because the technology is evolving is maybe missing something quite fundamental which has emotionally been ingrained in our society, which is that there are these places that we like to have where you can go and access things and be with people of different generations and different ages. And that's actually emotionally really important, and it's something that's profound. And also that in the world that we live in, we are more and more interested in adult education. We are lifelong learners. We no longer just finish our education at school, we keep going. And these environments are about that. They're about making opportunities to learn motor mechanics, yoga, acupuncture, or to read, the classics, Shakespeare, whatever you prefer, or to do your homework, if that's what you're interested in. So these environments become these nodes that are important. And for me, they're very important in neighborhoods which have the least kind of amount of public infrastructure, that they're very powerful and that they're very emotive spaces that can edify. So we always do the competitions for these libraries, usually in very low income communities. And this is one I'm really proud of. It's a very low cost project, but it doesn't look it, but trust me, it's extremely low cost. And it's in Washington. And it's at the end of a unique phenomenon in Washington, which is that you have these incredible belts of thick forest that are absolutely surrounded by these suburbs, these planned suburbs, which are so beautiful. So this is sort of some of that early turn of the century housing. The project acts as a pavilion. It's a gateway sort of between that housing and the park. It's in section. It looks kind of straightforward, I guess. It's basically it's a series of buildings within buildings which keep changing scale and work through a series of things which I'll just explain. The outer skin is a box which is only 40% glazed, but looks like it's glass. It's not. And then there's a kind of inner box which then has relationships to the sky and to the views, and then there's a very sort of varying set of systems that take you up through it. The skin is parametrically tuned so that it actually has a movement in it. It compresses and opens to do with perspective. And it's really talking about the nature in which you can bespoke industrialization now, that actually the bespoking of industrialization now is the ability to tune elements in the kind of the old sort of rational standardizing sort of production of things to what you need. The parametric tool can allow you to basically start to kind of make incredible geometries, incredible shapes, but using the efficiency of computers to allow you to not make waste so that you don't bring up the cost. So these are standard units, but they're cut through an efficiency diagram, and actually if you start to notice, the geometry expands up and down and moves across the space. This is the library. It's basically south-facing again, and it has this very large canopy, which basically projects over the entrance space and deals with the solar gain. This is the skin of the building. You see that the diamonds become more vertical and compressed as you turn around the corner. Forest and the suburbs. As you come close, you start to see the form, and you start to realize that these are actually just mirrors. Every other one is a mirror. And when you get really close, you start to see that it's mirror, view, and these are highly insulated volumes, and that's how we get now 60% insulation in the skin. The whole ground plane is perforate so that we don't kind of overclog the drains in the city with massive amounts of runoff water by making hard surfaces. And then when you go inside, you realize it's a wooden folly in the park. So it's basically a giant lattice of plywood. It's essentially Douglas fir plywood, which has just been beautifully joined together, and it's basically holding the glazing, making spaces, making that depth, which is the contradiction of the sort of exterior, and becomes the space for the enclosure. This is looking back to the forest, through the computer rooms, sort of teaching suites, sort of sort of special acoustic suites. And it's amazing, we see kids in here sitting with their computers, sort of using these as kind of loungers, which is not designed, but really exciting. We brought in Senegalese weavers to make the lampshades. So that was kind of incredible because the US doesn't like importing things that are not tested from Africa. So that was a really tough one, you can imagine. But we managed to get these lampshades through, which I'm really proud of. You can see those moment junctions. So this bending and really wanting to enjoy the bend and this idea of this wooded forest, almost playful-like is sort of articulated, and this is the way in which light and space and structure come together. Okay. I'll just show you this sequence, because this is the bit I like. The building basically on the forest side starts to just disappear as you move into the forest. And you start to see how the movement of the form, the glazing, makes these soft curves. And even in the autumn, when you think it's going to become more glaring, look. It completely disappears. And then in the evening, it's that. Moscow. Moscow is probably the biggest project we've done to date, a very challenging project, and a very different climate for me. I've sort of used to Europe and Africa before this, but moving north has been interesting. And so what we were asked to do, it was an international competition, and we were very lucky to win it, is to build a management school. It doesn't have a Harvard Business School or an Indian management school. You know, when I won this competition, I was blown away by the heritage of Russia, but it's such a shame that very little of it is actually real. It's the beginning of our idea of what industrialization does, to our sense of what modernism is. Comes from Russia, comes from futurists, comes from the constructivists, etc. But very little of it's left, except for things like Melnikov's extraordinary house, which is basically a tiny little studio. But something that's really powerful is Tatlin and Elazitsky's drawings. Look at this. This is really, for me, was the challenge. As a student, I said, in the 80s, I was like, I want to build this one day. And I think this is the project that started to do that for me. The site was extraordinary. If Tatlin, for me, is the body of modernism, with these forms, Malevich is the soul of emptiness, and his kind of incredible studies of nothing and pure geometry as making composition that has some kind of meaning. I thought that between these two poles is a kind of idea of modernity, and what can we do with this? It's ironic to me that these things exist on our continent, and some things that I love and look at, shrine structures in the Yoruba, weaving structures and their incredible ability to make abstraction and form. I said that there's actually connections between all these things, and I wanted to explore those. This is Brezhnev's Russia, incredible superstructures, and obviously the Kremlin that you know, which is really beautiful. This is the site, 27 acres. Malevich is buried here. This is the site in the spring. Moscow is beautiful like this for 3 months, then it looks like this. And this was my first site visit. It's 12 foot worth of snow. We disappeared into the first drop. It was extraordinary. And I'd never experienced that much snow in my life. It was a really new experience for an African boy. So we said, you can't make a campus, you can't make a quad, you can't make all those monastery types, but you can make something that's similar to, it has to be a kind of new kind of building, which is similar actually to the churches that were made in Russia. the old churches, which are basically giant wooden boxes. But they had on top of them also this kind of idea of an architectural city, an ideal city. I also thought that that was really powerful. I said, basically, let's make a hyper building, a giant, large-scale building, which is 300 feet deep, which organizes the entire school and is a kind of world. And above it, let's have a series of bars which have the education, a hotel, because the school is cross-subsidized by a conference center, which becomes the kind of premier conference center, which pays for a lot of the sort of overheads, and a sort of bodybuilding, which is gym, swimming pool, etc. But I said, let's make it, because it's the first building in the site, like a solar clock. So it's basically about the orientation and the location. This is the building in its landscape. So you can see this massive form. It's a kind of new giant form in its landscape. It's a kind of reverse. So this is this form, which is the clock. So each unit has to have a break. This is north. This is the southern aspect here. And basically the classrooms are between those, so that you always have school, view, daylight, school, view, daylight. But also the light breaks through. So you see the light through the day. It comes through in slices. And then in the north, you have exhibition and conferencing. And then up above, we basically use the Brezhnev engineers to make super buildings, like 300-foot long buildings with 125-meter cantilevers. Anyway, this is the world that is basically the school. It's almost like a colonnade, because there's no end. You're always going round and round. There's no dead end in this project. It was kind of a new experience for us. You always go round and round, and you always are kind of observing the views. And this is kind of what a super scale building can sometimes allow, which is something completely new and unexplored in architecture. We have sort of urban architecture, which is large, but not single forms in the landscape of this kind of scale. This is just showing you the programmatic way in which the school, which is red, uses it, blue, which is conference center, and the green, which is the back of house, administration, libraries, etc. This is the building in its context. It's a drawing of light as well, because basically using parametric geometry, it's basically concrete and glass. All of this is struck, weight-bound concrete. It's got a 2-meter deep foundation, which creates the cantilevers. These are 125-foot cantilevers, and it's all tiled in glass. It's basically 4 different colors of glass here, 4 different colors of glass here, 4 different colors. And it's basically this using parametric tools to just do it. So it's as efficient as making a standard glass wall, but it's a very different thing. This is the west, you'll see it. This is the south. This is Malevich's burial. I love this photo, it's for me. This is in the spring. This is how normal pictures are. So you see the east, and then you see the kind of way in which the stairs, which are the forms, bring you from the main space down into the public. You park underneath when it's snowing, sort of lobbies, and then up into the main spaces. We didn't do the main spaces, we just organized the form, but we kind of coordinated the key materials like white marble, louver, dark timber ceilings, etc. And then the giant skylights, and then the auditorium, which we did. So the auditorium, there are these large skylights in this 300-meter form, because you wonder how you get light in. Apart from the windows, we made what I call them clouds. These little clouds, which are basically the way in which you bring light down into the space. So these are huge, sort of floating forms that just kind of seem to meander across the space. And then there's moments between the different schools, classrooms, and then the west. It's the only building that's gold, so it's a sunset. So this is the western sun hits this, and it sort of refracts all over these buildings. We put in an Olympic pool, which the Russian sort of swimming troupe sort of use, so you can see them sometimes, which is kind of fabulous. The gymnasium, and then up on the roof. It's the south, so this is the register. These are the student blocks. It's the main form, and you see it's held on these 2 columns up and cantilevers over and out. The director's room, he furnished it, not us, but he's so proud of it. He sent me this image, and I always use it in my lectures, because he was so proud that he found an angled chair to match his windows. This is the Smithsonian in Washington. This brings us back to Washington. I don't know if you know about the Smithsonian. It's probably the largest cultural institution in the world. They have 23 museums. 12 of them are on the Mall. We're building, I think, the 24th. Yeah. This is I Am Pei, sort of masterpiece called the East Wing. This is Gordon Bunshaft's amazing structure. This is the original first Smithsonian. And it houses all the cultural depository of America. We're building the last museum on the Mall, which is supposed to kind of finish a plan made by an incredible master planner called L'Enfant, who designed Washington, who talked about the kind of essential components of culture being completed on the Mall to represent the idea of this new land, America. So we're completing that master plan after 200 years. It really single-handedly is about America fully understanding that in its history, the experience of the African-American community is central. It is the lens to understand the modernity, which is, and the perfection, whatever you may say of it, of America now. So essentially, it's kind of an amazing moment of going through civil rights, the extraordinary artifacts, right through to the agrarian slave trades, the slave kind of period in the sort of 17th and 18th century. And even going back to Africa. In the proposal for this competition, which was another international competition, said that we had to make a new kind of building for this kind of museum, and it had to be a building which, from its outset, didn't speak of one language, but spoke about the narrative of the journey, as well as speaking to the place. In West Africa, at that time, in the 17th century, the Yoruba were the most powerful, creative, the highest art form, you would say at the time. They were making bronze casts, clay, extraordinary figures that was not seen anywhere else on the continent. Their architecture created these caryatids, which were like memorials to kings or kingdoms. And when the king died, this was him sort of enthroned on his horse and his sort of trusted guides, and he always had a crown, which is this. It's a kind of triple-headed crown. It's almost like a Corinthian column. And I said that this crown is extremely important. It seems like nothing, but actually it is the single signature that speaks of a certain kind of high order. And I wanted to use that. In the making of America, this architecture, which we know, which is a kind of hybrid of the classical colonial architecture, was made by slaves. And the first guilds in America were metalwork and woodwork trades after being freed from the land. So this is the beginning of the professional class of the African-American people, these sort of incredibly direct sort of areas. And they made Charleston, New Orleans, etc., right up to Washington. This is L'Enfant's plan. L'Enfant had visited Europe and basically made a kind of version of Germany, France, and Italy. This is the capital. This is the Mall. This is the Potomac River. This is the White House here, which kind of deals with the kind of axes, and then a series of principal monuments. Then the museums were planned to be here. This is Washington in the winter. It's the White House. This is Washington's monument, which is Karnak's needle. This is one of Karnak's needles. So this is Egypt with Greek kind of architecture. There's a kind of language of the kind of perfecting of classical architecture here. This is our site. The site kind of is coordinated around these very important monuments: the Mall, the reflecting pool where Martin Luther King made his sort of million-man sort of speech. I Have a Dream speech. Lincoln is here. Martin Luther King is here now. Jefferson is here. The White House is here. The National Archive is here, and that's Congress. So it's a kind of hinge moment. And you can imagine the contestation. This is the most contested project that I've ever worked on. We spent 3 years getting it through the system. But we have the building. It's on site. We said that it had to be a pavilion of this form, and it had to acknowledge these relationships. It had to be a museum experience which, at the same time as kind of delving you into content, also related you to the place. It had to be a building which also responded climatically, because actually Washington is a swamp. So this architecture of like shading is really, really critical. So basically in the end, it's a cube which sits on a landscape, which kind of coordinates paths, you know, all the way across the site. The site was where a slave market used to be. So the history galleries are basically buried under the sacred ground. The history is immortalized in that site, and then the major galleries are up above in the light. The skin of the building is this corona system. It's another box within a box, but the entire ground floor, which is a 210-foot cube, is open to the four directions of light. This is a cross-section. This is the south. History galleries are here. The section of the history gallery is the same as the section of the building, 60 feet deep. So you'll go 60 feet deep, rise into a chamber of light, and rise up 60 feet and finish. We said that I wanted to kind of honor the people who made these things, so we used parametric tools to basically make a 21st century version of this. These are the studies we made to kind of deal with the climate control and the environmental studies. This is a one-to-one scale of the study. And it's essentially a cast aluminium, hybrid alloy cast aluminium, so it's super light, coated in liquid bronze. And it looks like this. So it is going to be a bronze new hybrid material, which is the solar screen, but also the kind of main sort of form of the building. The interior is just terrazzo stone and timber. This is a cantilever that's 210 feet on 2 columns and a 60-foot projection tilting to create a bending, reflecting pool so that this kind of, we work this out, so this gives you, we think, between a 5 to 10 degree temperature difference depending on the outside. Then the hall with the 4 directions of light is this free form of timber, this frozen moment. It's 500,000 pieces of timber. And it's actually the number of African Americans who were actually brought to America. They were only 500,000. The rest went to the Caribbean and to South America. The 11 million slaves that left Africa, only 500,000 went to America. 30 million African Americans exist now. It will kind of memorialize and exhibit places, you know, it goes across the entire range from history and will culminate in this chamber, which I love very much, which is basically the end of the history galleries, where you basically have an oculux to the Washington Monument, the first president of America, and to the edge of the building. And it's basically dedicated to Martin Luther King, who basically said that the most beautiful thing about rainfall was that it was like justice. That justice is rainfall, the cleansing form of justice. Thank you.